So we're going to pick off where we left off. Remember in the last video we were talking about the monetary system when we introduced the U.S. Federal Reserve, which as the United States central bank, it acts as the central agent for controlling the U.S. money supply. We talked about ways it does this, such as through the federal funds rate, through targeting interest rates, through targeting inflation. We talked about how it does this through reserve requirements. We talked about the money multiplier. In this chapter, we're going to get into more general theories of how money works and how money. At the core of this is theories of monetary growth and inflation. So this leads us to the classical theory of inflation. And in this theory, inflation and deflation, i.e. increases and decreases in the price level respectively, can be helpful, usually problematic, especially in the hyperinflation, for example, is a version of extreme inflation. So in the video we watched from the earlier chapter, the video on the previous video, the video on Who Wants to Be a Trillionaire, we talked about Zimbabwe's insane inflation rate and how the worthlessness of their currency ended up dramatically costing people's livelihoods, their ability to earn income and manage income. The paper was useless. Similarly, in the Weimar Republic, there was even a more extreme inflation rate percentage in the early 1920s. In fact, this is directly contributed to Hitler's rise. If you're interested in learning more about this, there's a fantastic book by Adam Tooze called The Wages of Destruction. Or for a SparkNotes version, there's this link to the review of the Weimar German hyperinflation. Just so you know, Weimar is the name for how scholars refer to Germany between World War I and Hitler's rise. Hyperinflation dramatically destabilized Germany during this period, and it led to political instability that allowed the rise of the fascists. So again, in monetary theory, beyond just your economic reasons, can have huge social influences. Now, in general, the level prices and the value of money are related by the sense that functionally, if the value of money increases, then the price level goes down. So basically, price changes reflect money has become less valuable more than they reflect people's taste fundamentally shifting. So inflation is an economy-wide phenomenon, not linked to just a single price. So we're now going to consider inflation as, rather than the change in the price of a basket of goods, a reflection on the value of money. Now, we had talked about this earlier in, I believe, chapter 12, 11 and 12 were in that period. We talked about things like the CPI, and we talked about the cost of a basket of goods. Now, we're specifically thinking of the price level as a reflection of how valuable and strong currencies are. When it reflects the purchasing power of a unit of currency. P is the price of an item. So if $1 equals one Coke, a dollar is worth one Coke. However, if $2 equals one Coke, a dollar is worth half a Coke. 1 over the price is a reflection of how much the currency is worth in the terms of how much it can purchase up. Now, this leads us to some interesting. Money's value is determined the same as everything else. It's determined by its, and the determinants of its price is determined. Fundamentally, money is supplied through Federal Reserve policy, and its demand is based upon people's desire for liquid funds. So what determines this equilibrium? Well, in the short, the Federal Reserve sets interest rates, which in turn define the supply of funds in the economy. In the long run, the price level ultimately influences the price. The price level influences the amount of demand. So when you have inflation, what this means is that people will demand less money because they don't need as much because their currency they have is purchased. When there's actually going to be more demand for money, and the reason why is because the currency is weak, and so there has to be more. So, for example, in the Zimbabwe video, you ultimately needed trillions and trillions of dollars to buy. And that was the reason. That's an example of why people need a more demand. They need a nominally increased demand for currency, even though they don't necessarily have changed their preferences in demand for goods. So just to look at this market in graphical formation, what we finally see here is that monetary demand functions exactly how you would expect it to. As money goes down, monetary demand increases. The difference here is that money supply is vertical, i.e. it is perfectly inelastic. And the reason we say the money supply is perfectly inelastic is because, as we talked about last chapter, it's determined by the Federal Reserve. This is the quantity is fixed by the Federal Reserve. It is unresponsive to price. and it is unresponsive to the price level. In fact, it is what determines the price and the price level. So over here on the left, notice we have the value of money. This axis is the value of money, and this is defined as 1 over the price level. Notice that as we go down, this represents a decrease in the value of money. In contrast, on the right hand, we have the price level, and as it increases, this is a reflection of the fact that the price level overall is increasing. Now, in this example, we have the value of money being 1/2 of a good, i.e. this is the equilibrium value of money, and it corresponds to a price level of 2 in this example. So this is the intersection at our equilibrium quantity. And at this intersection, it determines ultimately what our price level is and the value. So that's learning from equilibrium. Since we can't determine quantity, what we can determine is that we can conclude the price level and the value of money. Now, what's the effects of a monetary injection? Well, the quantity theory of money is a theory that asserts that the quantity of money available determines the price level, and that the quantity of money is available determines the inflation rise. So a very famous economist, Milton Friedman, he's who does the video on the Depression that we watched from the previous chapter, he argues that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Now, you might have some critiques of this. For example, in recent years, we've been expanding the money supply at an insane rate. We've popped more money into the economy than ever before, and yet we have not had the inflation you might expect with that dramatic increase in the money supply. So there are some questions here. There's also questions of, are there things such as deflationary, as in better technology, that's ultimately reducing our cost? Is that inflation? Ultimately, this question here, though, is basically, is there a difference between the price of goods and their price level versus inflation? However, if we look over here in graph 2, we can see the obvious conclusion of an increase in monetary demand. It's exactly what you think it would be for a shift in demand in any other market, right? So, sorry, about increase in the money supply. Increase in money supply leads to the exact same consequence you would expect for anything else with an increase in the money. So, or the increase of supply in any other good. So, as the supply shifts right, what we would normally expect from just a typical, we would think that the supply increase leads to a lower and increased quantity per supply. This is the same consequence we get when we increase the money supply. An increase in the money supply leads to a decrease in the value of money because our monetary demand now intersects the money supply at a lower price. So the value of money goes down, and that leads to an increase in the price level. So I want to clarify one thing here, and this is important. The steps for this are the money supply changes, the value of money then changes, and then the price level changes because the value of money changes. All right, so to be clear, the step is Federal Reserve increase the money supply, the increase in the money supply decreased the value of money, and then the decrease in the money led to an increase in the price level. Again, we notice this because we were originally at point A in equilibrium, and we have now moved to point B equilibrium. So a brief look at the adjustment process. Injection of money. The immediate effect is, of course, the increased money supply, i.e. we have excess money. Since we now have excess money, people need to get rid of this. So they buy goods and services, they invest or save in someone who turns around and spends. This gives rise to a general increase in the demand for goods and services. Note, money does not affect the economy's ability to produce goods and services. However, remember we mentioned this in a previous chapter, it is the factors of production which determines the economy's output, not the money supply. The amount of money is not a factor of production. We don't use money to just make stuff. We use money to purchase the items we need to make stuff. This means we have a rise in the price level. And finally, since inflation increases, this cancels out the monetary injection and the monetary equilibrium is restored. Now, there's some more theories to add to this that are important. The classical dichotomy and monetary neutrality. The classical dichotomy states there's a theoretical separation of nominal and real variables. This might sound familiar to you. Remember that in chapter 10, when we introduced GDP, we distinguished between nominal GDP, which was simply the price times the goods we've made in a year, and real GDP, which was a quote-unquote real value of the output in a given year. We call this a dichotomy because there's a division into two groups. In this case, we have nominal and real variables. These are our two groups. And fundamentally, we also can think of false dichotomies. And a false dichotomy is a false choice between two options. That's not necessarily relevant for the classical dichotomy, but it is a useful bit of information to keep in mind in your back pocket. Now, nominal variables measured in monetary units. So a nominal variable adjusts based upon a measurement in money. Real variables, in contrast, are variables measured in physical units. You might remember this a little bit back from chapter 3 when we were talking about trade. We talked about the real cost of something was the cost you gave up in terms of the goods and opportunities you gave up to manufacture other goods. In this example, real variables are simply things like output as opposed to the value of that output. This dichotomy makes prices tricky. Since prices are nominal, we have to work around them. So, and it's important to recognize this. Prices basically serve as a function of a proxy for value. So if a Coke costs $1.50 and a burger costs $3, that's their nominal value. Their nominal value is the money paid for them. But the real value of a Coke can actually be converted to a ratio between its price and the burger's price. And so a value of $1.50 to $3 or half a hamburger. So what we know is a Coca-Cola is worth half a hamburger. In contrast, we can then consider the hamburger and determine it has a real value of 2 Cokes. So basically, you can think of taking the price and converting it and shifting it in a way to make it sound like the price of any two goods and compare them in relationship to the amount of money required. Why the dichotomy? The reason why is different forces influence real and nominal variables. Under classical analysis, nominal values are influenced by the monetary system. So when we've been talking about inflation and creating inflation, this is what we're getting at. Whereas money is largely relevant to explain real variables. So again, real GDP is unaffected by the amount of money in the supply. Now, there's a final point that comes from this, and this is monetary neutrality. And monetary neutrality is the proposition that changes in the money supply do not affect variables. So an increase in the U.S. money supply does not change the amount of wheat the United States can produce in a is determined by the amount of land available to grow wheat, the amount of capital available and necessary to create that wheat, and ultimately the amount of labor available to wheat. Now, one of the ways we measure this and understand this relationship is through the velocity and the quantity equation. So the velocity of money is basically the rate at which money changes hands. So just think, for example, that in physics, velocity refers to the speed an object travels. The equation for velocity of money is V equals velocity, P equals the price level, times Y, the output in terms of real GDP, and this is divided by M, the quantity of money. Now this kind of makes sense because when we have the price level times the output, and this gives us our nominal GDP, what we're really getting at is something to the effect of how much money was spent in a given year. There is a divided by how much money we actually have in the supply. That relation tells us the velocity, i.e. the rate at which money is moving through the economy. Now, there's a cool thing we can do here. We can rearrange the relationship. And a slight rearrangement yields M times V equals P times Y. And this is called the quantity equation because it relates the quantity of money to the nominal value of output. And it demonstrates an increase in the money supply reflecting a change in other variables. Given that velocity is stable, we actually find that it does not change that much. People do. They don't randomly abruptly decide not to spend any money and don't randomly abruptly decide to spend all their money. And as a result, output is also unaffected by money, remember, because the Y variable output is a real term. So money doesn't affect. That means this requires the price level to change with the money. V is constant and Y is, then if M goes, P must be in these two identities, right? So if V is constant and M, the P must also increase to offset the M. And again, this ties together the idea that the directly leads to increases in the price level. Now, just for some proof, don't take my word for it that velocity is stable. This is simply an example of evidence of this quantity theory of money. So notice that this red line is your nominal GDP, and this green line is your M2, i.e. the money. Notice these two track really well together over time, while velocity has remarkably stayed fairly constant. The point here is that the nominal GDP, i.e. the GDP and output linked to the price level, largely in line with the money. While velocity stays constant, and this is evidential of the fact that quantity theory is actually. Now, real quick, this is just a good slide to memorize what the quantity theory of money is. So with our first point, we argue the velocity of money is relatively stable over time. That's what we just saw in the previous slide. Because velocity is stable, when the central bank changes the quantity of money M, it causes proportionate changes in the nominal value of output P times Y. So again, since velocity is stable, a change in M must result in a change in P times Y. Again, that's because our equation is M times V equals P times Y, so P times Y must change if M changes. Now, since the economy's output goods, Y is primarily determined by factors supplies, labor, physical capital, human capital, and natural resources, and the available production of technology. In particular, because money is neutral, money does not affect output. So again, this pops us back to our concept of monetary neutrality. Since monetary neutrality is real, we know that Y variable does not change. So to be V does not change, Y does not change. The quantity value M has changed. With output Y determined by factor supplies and technology, when the central bank alters the money supply M and induces proportional changes in the nominal value of output P times Y, these changes are reflected in changes in the price level. Therefore, when the central bank increases the money supply rapidly, the result is a high rate of inflation. This is one of the big things that's concerning and scaring individuals right now about understanding what the Federal Reserve is doing today to combat COVID and other financial crises. The crisis from 0708 is the Federal Reserve has rapidly expanded the money supply. And yet, strangely, we have not had anything too radically happen yet in regards to the overall inflation rate. So this is a serious question people have is, why is that case? However, we've talked about that there is an exception in the sense that in recent years, inflation has not been as dramatic as we would expect, given the amount of money popped into the. We can find out that there is a reason why governments don't necessarily just print cash. And what the inflation tax is that, believe it or not, the United States actually makes a profit when it manufactures money. So when the United States government prints money, when the U.S. Treasury prints U.S. dollars, it typically makes money. This is a process called seigniorage. Now, seigniorage basically leads to the U.S. government increasing its revenues, and because the U.S. can just print money and increase the money supply through this, it can theoretically then influence and increase the rate of inflation, and it can influence the price level. And because the U.S. government is making a profit as it prints this money, and because the price level is then increasing and the value of money is decreasing, we call this the inflation tax. And the reason we call it the inflation tax is because it is an indirect tax. Basically, what we're saying is that by the government making money off printing money and by people losing money due to inflation, the government has effectively taxed the wealth of the population in order to enrich itself. And just to give you an example of how this has worked in other countries, notice in Austria, Hungary, Germany, and Poland, 4 unique different examples, we find that, guess what? The price level traces really with money supply in almost every one of our examples. In fact, in every example, the money supply and the price trace very easily. Now, there's more problems with this, and problems derived from what we call the Fisher. The Fisher effect is there is a 1-for-1 adjustment of nominal interest rate to the inflation rate. So when the Fed increases the rate of money growth, the long run results with a higher inflation rate and a higher nominal interest rate. And just a reminder, real interest rate equals nominal interest rate minus inflation rate. We've discussed this in an earlier chapter. However, nominal interest rate then equals the real interest rate plus the inflation rate. Now, when you have a high inflation rate, what that means is you will have a higher nominal interest rate. Even though the real interest rate can stay the same, you will have a distortion due to it. Now, just to give you an example here, let's look at this relationship between the nominal interest rate and the inflation rate. So this is inflation, the red line, and notice that it actually fairly accurately fluctuates along with the nominal interest rate. Now, notice one more thing. Do you see that the spikes in inflation typically precede changes in the nominal interest rate? The reason why is because the nominal interest rate is actually determined by people. We set the nominal interest. Banks figure out what interest rates they're going to loan at. Inflation, while the Federal Reserve can try policies to elicit a specific level, is not specifically controlled by the Federal Reserve. So this nominal interest rate is largely a mixture of guessing interest rates based upon what's happening with the inflation rate. Now, inflation comes. One of those costs, though, is not the inflation fallacy. And this is the idea that there is a fall in your purchasing power. In reality, inflation does not reduce people's real purchasing power. Theoretically, inflation increases not only the price of goods and services, but also the price of factors of production, which offset it. So basically, you might think inflation means you are poor. Typically, what inflation means is actually you just get paid more to compensate for the loss of the value of the money you were compensated at. So your job doesn't get less valuable. It's just your now. However, there's shoe leather costs, and shoe leather costs are the resources wasted with inflation to reduce their monetary holding. So this could be things like wasteful spending because you're worried about your money losing its value. Ultimately, the reason it's called shoe leather costs was the idea is you're going to wear out your shoes going to the bank. Now, admittedly, online has done a lot to kind of combat that, right? Because we can go to the bank and use digital and online banking, that makes this not as much an issue. However, though, we also have menu cost, and this is the cost of changing prices. This is an example. About 10 years ago, 12 years ago, you could go to Subway and you could get what we call a $5 footlong. A $5 footlong was Subway's $5 sandwich in a footlong. You can't get $5 footlong anymore, right? It's a promotion now. It's nostalgic. The reason why is because these prices have had to change as inflation has crept in. The reality is these prices haven't just changed. Subway's had to hire teams of economists and teams of financial analysts to figure out how inflation is going to affect the prices of their sandwiches and how do you adjust these. So that's how you wind up with weird prices for sandwiches, right? Like food isn't just neatly priced at these numbers, right? So now you see $6.89, $6.49 for meals that they otherwise wouldn't be. There's another aspect of this. Inflation-induced tax portions. So the U.S. government taxes capital gains, and we mentioned these back in chapter 13, I believe. Capital gains are profits made on investment. Consider inflation. They only counting return, i.e., the tax is determined by your nominal change. So think of your savings account. What was the inflation rate last year? Yeah, that kind of is crazy, right? Like you probably had a near 0% interest rate in yours, but inflation was 2.5%. But we're going to give a specific example of this. These are two economies, economy A and economy B. Economy A has price stability, has inflation. The real interest rate in both economies is 4%. That means if you take out a loan or if you invest, you're going to get a 4% return. The inflation rate is 0 in economy A, and the inflation rate is 8 in economy B. So the nominal interest rate, i.e., adding the real interest rate and inflation rate, gets you 4 for economy A, and it is 12% for economy B. With this, if we factored in at the end of the year that we're going to grow your taxes, or you're going to be taxed, you're going to have a reduced interest due to a 25% tax. So wealth technically grew 4% or 12%. However, you're going to get taxed 25% of nominal growth. So in economy A, you pay 1% of in tax. In economy B, meanwhile, you have to pay 3% in taxes. After tax, your nominal interest rate then your nominal interest rate minus the tax rate. So 4 minus 1 equals 3%. And your after-tax nominal interest rate for economy B is 12 minus 3 equals 9. Here's where things get sticky. After tax, your real interest rate in economy A is now only 3%. On economy B, you do 9 minus 8, right? So you have a after-tax nominal interest rate of 9%. You had a 8% inflation rate, so 9 minus 8, you only have 1% real return. And so basically what we find is that when you have low price stability, that means that you will grow higher, less in taxes, and you'll be wealthier overall. However, when you have higher levels of inflation, this is another way the inflation tax affects you, is it distorts the impact of taxes on you. Finally, inflation costs continued, and this is our final slide today. They create confusion and inconvenience. This isn't really anything to dig too deeply. However, a significant issue, though, is that this arbitrarily redistributes. The reason why loans are determined in nominal value. So therefore, when deflation or inflation occurs, money shifts regardless of the merit. When deflation occurs, there's a transfer of wealth from debtors to lenders as loans grow more value. So since your loan is in a nominal value, if there is deflation, that means the currency is getting stronger. If your currency is getting stronger, what that means is that the real value of your loan is also increasing. So that means there's a transfer of wealth from debtors to lenders. However, when there's inflation, the opposite occurs. There's a transfer of wealth from lenders to debtors as loans grow less valuable. So there's a high inflation rate, debts become much cheaper because the initial value of the loan becomes worth less and less. Now, while inflation is bad, though, just know that inflation may be worse. The Great Depression was brought on by a deflationary period in the 1920s. And Japan similarly suffered an extremely long economic stagnation from 1998 to 2012. The Friedman rule, and which honestly has still been somewhat persistent past this, your textbooks published in 2013 is why this doesn't. The Friedman rule, actually, though, is a prescription for some moderate deflation because taking into account the nominal interest rate we saw on the last slide, inflation would reduce the nominal interest rate and the cost of holding money. So theoretically, a moderate deflation could be beneficial to the economy. Now, just on a fun case study, and this is our last thought for this chapter, think about the Wizard of Oz. Did you notice? A fun bit of U.S. history. The Wizard of Oz is an allegory for monetary politics, and that was the issue in the 1890s and the 19th. So the issue was not, you might believe, affordable care. It was not Social Security. It was not military spending. It was not abortion. It was not LGBTQ rights. It was monetary politics. This was the thing. This was the thing people got in debates about. So the Wizard of Oz was Guthrie told to follow? Right. Yellow Brick Road is what takes you to the Wizard of Oz. Is it a surprise that the wizard is then kind of a crony-esque individual and a bit of a fraud? Absolutely not. The Cowardly Lion is often considered William Jennings Bryan, the very big populist speaker who gave a famed speech called The Cross of Gold, which was a criticism of the gold standard. Similarly, William McKinley is often considered the Tin Man, i.e. a hollow tin metal man without a heart. On a final fun note, what were the colors of the slippers that Dorothy taps to go home? It's ruby in the movie, but in the book, they're actually silver slippers. So she taps silver slippers together, and it takes her back home. So this is just kind of an emphasis of like, these are significant issues. And one of the things that was argued about this gold standard versus silver standard is which meant farmers had to pay more money in real loans to bankers, while silver would have caused inflation and led to farmers actually gaining wealth from their borrowers as their real debt declined. So this is just one of these things that is a big question, and it's going to become a big question again, particularly when we think of things like student loans, etc. But that's all I have. This is fascinating. in the next chapters, we're going to start refocusing the economy into a global. All right. Thank you all for coming. Hope you enjoyed, and take care, and I'll see you next.